Welcome to Unlocking Nature. Together, we've been telling the story of African conservation since 2020. Tonight, we are talking about living corridors, and it's all about reconnecting people and nature, sometimes at the scale of a garden and sometimes at the scale of many horizons. But tonight, you will learn how one isolated elephant planted the seed for a living corridor. More about that later. Now, allow me a minute to introduce our guest experts who will be guiding our conversation. Dr. Nkabeng Mzeleni leads the Cape Research Centre at SANParks, where she guides conservation research and supports protected area management across diverse ecosystems. Rian Burning is the CEO of the Eden to Addo Corridor Initiative, where she leads efforts to connect landscapes, communities, and livelihoods across a 400-kilometer ecological corridor in South Africa. Dr. Ian Little is the head of conservation at the Endangered Wildlife Trust, where he has worked since 2010, leading national efforts to protect threatened habitats and species. Peter Chadwick is the CEO of the Conservation Landscapes Institute, leading the creation of a 1 billion-hectare connected conservation corridor in South Africa's Eastern Cape, with nearly 40 years of experience across 25 African countries. I would like to acknowledge the work of Professor Terina Durkheim. Unfortunately, she cannot join us tonight due to an urgent health issue in the family. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let's get into the conversation. And with that, I would like to ask Rian if she can please lead us into the conversation and help us to think about what is a living corridor and why is it a living corridor, and how is it relevant to the issues that conservation face as we are here in Africa.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Johan. So I'll be talking about living corridors and how they can be spaces to catalyze both functional ecosystems, but also functional human communities. And I love to start with this image, this juxtaposition of the protected areas in Africa and how dispersed they are and the spaces between them, in contrast to the river systems and how nature shows us that life is about connection. And rivers are the original and ultimate corridors and connectivity. And if we zoom into South Africa and Southern Africa, you can see how dispersed our protected areas are in South Africa. And in fact, the landmass protected officially as a protected area is far less than our neighbors on the northern front. And Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, they're in the 30-40%, whereas we, depending on where you get your data, are between 9 and 16% of our land is protected. And once again, the rivers show us that there is no disconnection and life is continually attempting to connect. Because life ultimately is relationships. The mycorrhizal and mycelium networks in the wood wide web are connecting trees, sending nutrients, and the same applies to the neural pathways in our brain, the cilia in our lungs. Life ultimately is about relationship. And yet we as humans tend to want to compartmentalize. We seem to be living in the great age of disconnect. And we apply this disconnection to the landscape in very physical ways. And this is an example of a very fragmented landscape here in the garden route where I'm from. And there is no opportunity for connectivity between the mountains and the ocean for animal movement, which is critical, as you'll see as we move through this discussion, for the functionality of ecosystems. So habitat fragmentation is often considered the major near-term threat to biodiversity and ecosystem function. And yet, how many times around the dinner table do you talk about habitat fragmentation? It's not spoken of very often, and yet it is a serious and major threat to the functioning of our ecosystems. And when it comes to indicator animals such as tortoises, who are so critical for dispersing seeds in the succulent karoo, the barriers of fencing, both electric and non-electric fences, are horrifying. You can go to fence lines in the karoo and you will see rows of dead tortoises. And what does that mean for them and for our ecosystems? And of course, as Johan mentioned, this is Oakwood, or Strangefoot, as some call her, the last free-ranging, free-roaming wild elephant in South Africa. But she has become for us a symbol of what can happen to a species when the landscape is fragmented by human activities. And she is a symbol for what can happen to other species in different contexts. So while she may never join her kin again, we can work towards ensuring that her fate is for other species too. But it's not just about the animals and their need to connect and move, but very much the role they play in ecosystems. Because the flow of energy, nutrients, biota, and abiotic matter through the mosaic depends only on three primary vectors: wind, water, and animals. So the movement of animals, therefore, is not only critical to the survival of local populations, but also to the ecological function of the wider landscape. This constant circulatory movement of animals is so critical to the integrity and survival of our ecosystems. And in South America and North America, with the Nature Conservancy, they have modeled how animals will need to move in response to climate change. So we have the blue is the birds, the pink is the mammals, and the yellow are the amphibians. And this modeling shows that animals will need to move to access food, water in different contexts as climate change ramps up. So the protected areas that I showed you in the first few slides, they do form the cornerstone of nature conservation, but in isolation are insufficient for conserving biodiversity and absorbing environmental shocks in the face of climate change and habitat loss. Species need to track fluctuating environmental conditions through fragmented and anthropogenic landscapes. Landscape connectivity is consequently an important tool for maintaining resilience to global change, and science has convincingly demonstrated that interconnected protected areas are much more effective than disconnected human-dominated systems in providing resilient and sustainable ecosystems. And this new understanding of the fundamental importance of ecological connectivity is driving a global shift in conservation practice. So let's get into the definitions and what is this connectivity and what are these corridors that we speak of? According to the IUCN Guidelines for Conserving Connectivity, an ecological network for conservation is a system of core habitats, and that includes protected areas both on private land and national parks, OECMs, which are other effective conservation measures, and intact natural areas that may not be protected. And these are connected by ecological corridors, which is established, restored as needed, and maintained to conserve biological diversity in systems that have been fragmented. So it is a network, and the ecological corridors form part of that, and they are clearly defined geographical space that is governed and managed over the long term to maintain or restore effective connectivity. And what is this ecological connectivity? It's the movement of populations, individuals, genes between populations, communities, and ecosystems, as well as that of non-living material from one location to other. And without this movement, we get genetic stagnation in these isolated pockets of old school fortress conservation. So this is a very new way of thinking of conservation. And a protected area is a clearly defined geographical space recognized, dedicated, and managed through other effective means to achieve the long-term conservation with associated ecosystem services and cultural values. So those are the definitions, which are lovely to refer to. But the Convention on Conservation of Migratory Species says that ecological connectivity is defined as the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes that sustain life on Earth. So literally, this movement of animals, as I said, is like the circulatory system. If you had to see the Earth as a human body, then this movement of animals is the circulatory system that keeps all our vital organs alive. And going back to what exactly is this corridor that we're speaking of? It's not a passageway through the house. At its simplest, an ecological corridor is a strip of land connecting two protected areas. And this connectivity, as I've already touched on, is essential for restoring the flow of life, for freedom of movement, and vital ecological processes such as seed dispersal, pollination, functional rivers, predator-prey interactions, nutrient cycling, genetic diversity, and ecosystem integrity. So corridors allow nature to weave the fabric of life back together, enabling ecosystems to recover and regenerate. Life's imperative is to create conditions conducive to life. And by enabling these corridors, we're assisting nature to do what she does best and create conditions conducive to life. This is an example of an ecological network and the different corridors you may have. So you have the green areas are the core areas, the core habitat. And linking those, you could have a linear corridor, you could have a landscape corridor, or you could have a stepping stone corridor, which would provide refuge for animals in a landscape where there is not a lot of habitat still available for them. And then you would have these buffer zones around the core areas. The map on the right, the pink squiggly line shows the movement of elephant and how they don't stay in a national park in these transfrontier conservation areas. They move through state forests and into community conservancy areas as well. So why does connectivity matter? Because, as I showed you in that map of Africa, our protected areas are increasingly isolated from one another due to land transformation and fragmentation. And the biggest threats are land transformation and climate change. And this isolation increases the risk of extinction. So biodiversity is so important for healthy ecosystem functioning and ecosystem services, which we are dependent on, as well as all the other animals in the ecosystem. You know, they're providing services such as food and water to us, and they're regulating the climate and preventing disease, supporting services such as nutrient cycles for us, for healthy soils and oxygen production, and then the very human, cultural, and relational services and recreational benefits. And when it comes to the science of connectivity, there are two ways of looking at it. So the structural connectivity is very much about the lay of the land and what landscapes, which areas, which riparian areas lend themselves towards natural corridors. So that's very much what is permeable and what are the barriers, such as fences, roads. So this doesn't take into account animal behavior, but just what the lay of the land is. And then the functional connectivity is very much about the animal behaviors and their risk tolerance and how they move through the landscape based on that. And tracking them really gives a sense of how functional an ecological network is. This was some fantastic research done by some master's students who came over from Wageningen University, and that the biggest green blob in the middle is Baviaanskloof World Heritage Site. And then we have Addo just to the northeast of that. And they modeled how animals would move between protected areas using circuit theory and least cost path. So the very red areas show how mammals would move between protected areas. And they used some specific species from elephant to baboon to otter to kudu to see how animals would move through the landscape. And if you very quick with your phone, you can use the QR code to find that paper. And then, of course, it's not all positive and good news. There are threats and challenges to connectivity, especially if you look at that diagram on the right. We have transgressed 6 of the 9 planetary boundaries, and biosphere integrity and land system change are, of course, way in overshoot. This is from 2023. The latest figures from 2025 show that we have, in fact, overshot 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries. So in terms of connectivity, the threats are human-wildlife conflict. They can be seen as vectors for disease, the physical barriers, as mentioned, human disturbance and land use change, climate change, policy change, long-term funding for protected areas and corridors, poverty and social pressures, and the ongoing ecological degradation. So I just want to give credit to Professor Katerina, who was unfortunately not able to be with us. She was supposed to be doing this presentation this evening, and some of the papers that have happened under her supervision or by herself, so that you can follow up on that. Or if you would like to find out more about connectivity research, you're welcome to email her at Wildlife Free to Roam. I'm sure Marette will put the email address in the show notes. But what connectivity science now provides are practical tools to reduce conflict, protect biodiversity, guide land use planning, which is very important, support livelihoods, and build climate resilient landscapes. And I just wanted to show you this gorgeous artwork, which was very unexpectedly seen on the Robberg Coastal Corridor, a very narrow strip of corridor connecting Robberg Nature Reserve with Garden Route National Park. Very unexpected to see an aardvark, but there she is. And so these corridors become refuge for animals when the landscape is very transformed. But it's not all about the animals and the ecosystems. It's very much about being living corridors for humans and for nature. And so sustainable livelihoods are critical and a cornerstone to biodiversity stewardship and corridor custodianship. So things like well-managed agricultural practices, land restoration, ecotourism, guided hikes, cultural experiences, weekend accommodation, alien clearing, plant nurseries, research support, the list can go on. But it is critical that there are sustainable livelihoods within these living corridors. So farming can very much happen in protected areas because management plans of a protected environment include biodiversity considerations. Farmers are exploring regenerative agriculture and healing the soil, regenerating the soil. One of the farmers in our corridor says he's not farming goats, he's farming soil, which of course is quite correct. Herding and shepherd projects as alternatives to lethal predator management and mobile kraals. And land restoration is also very important in terms of job creation in rural areas. Alien clearing for water security, fire security, and biodiversity protection. It ticks so many boxes. And then this image is of some land restoration workers in the Springbok Vlakte doing ponding work to return water content and biodiversity to the soil and prevent soil erosion. And then, of course, ecotourism, which was also a great job creation spinner in nature areas, guided trails, game lodges, game drives, and then all the micro enterprises that support tourism, such as food growing and firewood collection. Because these corridors are in exquisite wilderness areas, and so, yeah, just fantastic for tourists and locals to visit. But this connectivity of a landscape for animal movement and connectivity on the social landscape for sustainable livelihoods is not the only kind of connectivity that is important. It's also about the collaboration between the organizations who are working to establish these living corridors. And that is a very, very important factor in the equation. And so this is an example of where different organizations are collaborating towards creating what Sand Parks are now working towards their Vision 2040 and these mega living landscapes. And so it's about very much collaborating in creating these mega living landscapes where there's multi-land use activities and sustainable livelihoods, and then connectivity of critical biodiversity areas. So I would like to end with a quote from one of my favorite books, Braiding Sweetgrass, by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and a thought to leave you with, that what we contemplate here is more than ecological restoration. It is the restoration of relationship between nature and people. We are dreaming of a time when the land might give thanks for the people. And there is a corridor where humans and nature can flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Rian, for setting the scene for us in such a wonderful way. What a beautiful story, or the beginning of a beautiful story. It is to be continued. I want to ask Ian, now that we've seen all the challenges involved, and I can imagine that working with so many stakeholders can be quite challenging, what makes a living corridor truly functional and sustainable in the long term? And what ecological, social, and institutional elements must align for all of this to work together and be sustainable?
Yeah, thanks, and thanks, Rian, for that introductory talk. You really covered the essence of what corridors are. When we start digging into the question of functionality, it's somewhat nuanced, and it becomes rather complicated. Functionality is really dependent on the objective of the corridor and the scale of that corridor, and the scale really is dependent on the objective. From a conservation perspective, this is often driven by focal species and sometimes ecosystem service provision. Now, focal species can vary from small creatures like frogs and even invertebrates to the more charismatic species like leopards and elephants that cover big distances. And in many instances, the focal species will dictate what mitigation factors are required in order to assess the functionality of that corridor in terms of animal movement. And we need to look at some examples to really understand these nuances. A classic example here in Cape Town, where I live, is the western leopard toad, which really requires very specific types of interventions in terms of road mitigation in order to allow them to move between the ponds where they exist in the urban environment. And then we look at more free-ranging species like pangolins that really struggle from not just trade, but linear infrastructure like electric fences. Rian mentioned fences and the impacts of fences, but specifically electric fences are an absolute catastrophe for species like pangolins and many others. They're one of at least 30 species that are very seriously impacted, with estimates of around 1,000 pangolins a year dying on electric fences, significantly more than what the trade impact is. And then looking at even more free-ranging species like vultures, where we need to really understand that in order to provide corridors for species that move as much as vultures do, we need to create vast safe spaces. And in order to do that, we need to remove the threats from those landscapes. And it's important to recognize here that this certainly doesn't mean anything like fortress-type conservation in terms of creating protected areas. Vultures occur across agricultural landscapes all over the world, and they can very, very well survive in coexistence with people in those landscapes, as long as the key threats are removed. Then looking at another example of linear infrastructure challenges are when we look at other large bird species like bustards and harriers. And in this instance, power lines are really the culprit, and increasingly wind turbines are becoming a major challenge to some of these species. Black harriers, for example, the models suggest that if 3 or more adults die per year, the species is going to go into decline and move towards extinction. So we really can't afford to mess around with some of these species when it comes to the importance of corridors for their movement. Now, looking at some of the more big and fuzzy charismatic species, a very good example is the cheetah. Now, cheetahs, in the South African context anyway, have very few corridors where they can move. So they are now actively managed as a meta population. And that means that we have to actively move individuals between reserves, between fenced reserves, in order to maintain that genetic integrity that Rian was referring to earlier. And currently we're managing more than 70 population reserves. And this is going to go on in perpetuity. And it's the only way that the species is going to persist in South Africa and in many other countries. So this just illustrates the importance of establishing these corridors at this stage for species like cheetah. And then we move up a scale to things like elephants that really require big areas and linked to elephants, other species like African wild dogs, where there's significant human-wildlife conflict implications on the edges of not just the protected areas where they live, but the corridors that are created for them. So we also need to consider the mixed-use value of these corridors and the social benefits in terms of food and water security across large landscapes. And we need to think about this into the very long term. Now is the time to consider and to plan and to spatially structure what our world is going to look like in the long-term future. And we cannot afford to think like politicians in 4-year cycles or 5-year cycles. We have to think in 100-year cycles. Ultimately, functionality depends on scale. And that scale must take factors like edge effects and island biogeography and even ecology of fear into account in order to ensure functionality. I'm sure we'll dig into a lot more of what I've alluded to here in the rest of the discussion. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Ian. You touched on scale there. I think, Nkabeng, with you working in the Cape National Parks a lot, where I've recently seen a photograph of some baboons crossing the street with a zebra crossing to go from one part of Table Mountain National Park to the next. I want to ask you this question about scale. At what scale do corridors need to be designed to remain effective, and what friction is there then with other land use needs, and how do you manage that process?
Thank you, Johan, and that's a great question about scale, because when we think about ecological design and the scale that needs to reflect, yes, the ecological aspect, and not too much to be limited by political and the different land uses or administrative uses that are taking place around it. So from a sandbox perspective, the approach that we've been using recognizes that connectivity from a national perspective needs to be linking protected areas, yes, but it also needs to take into consideration, as mentioned before, some of these strategic water areas, some of these key critical biodiversity areas. And we also need to be considering some of the existing infrastructure that's in the area as well. And that means that we need to look at what is enabling. So we look at activities that are compatible with what's taking place from an ecological perspective. And in so doing, we're able then to allow processes to move through the system. Now, that's from an ecological perspective, but we also need to understand that we do have boundaries. And with some of the boundaries, they can be fence boundaries or they can be the land use boundaries. So the scale will need to does take into consideration the ecological aspects, but also some of the land uses that are actually taking place, and that these are shared living spaces. And when we call them living spaces, it means that they're integrated with private land, communal land, biosphere reserves, conservation areas, and also other use areas, as mentioned by Rian, where there's other activities taking place, but they are compatible with ecological corridors still. So essentially, when we're speaking about scale, we're looking at it from the perspective of taking buffers, taking boundaries, and moving it beyond just core areas, and taking into account the activities that are taking place inside, because the activities, as we mentioned, are living spaces, are a shared living space and a shared use space, and we need to take that into consideration. So essentially, what ends up happening is that our corridors, and I like the term that we've been using of living corridors and living landscapes. This is what they essentially become, because it's the ecological and the social elements that are taken into consideration as we move beyond the boundaries. And this requires us to actually start taking into consideration what are, as mentioned previously by Ian, when it comes to political aspects of it, not to be limited by that, but to take this into take it into the future going forward as well. So these governance frameworks become very important to be able to have legitimacy in those different landscapes. I think I'll just end there for now.
Thanks, Nkabeng. So Peter, you work in a massive landscape. At what stage of the project do you look at this and you tick the box and say this thing was a success, or is it always a process?
Yeah, thanks very much. And I think what's very clear is that from the previous speakers is we're working in a very complex environment, a very dynamic environment. And I think indicators of success are extremely difficult. I think, most people will look at it from a perspective of a physical indicators of how many hectares have been added, how much alien plants have been removed, how many new species are returning, like those aardvark to areas where they didn't exist, new corridors for species, etc. But I think there's a far more complex, almost an ideological, philosophical component that we actually also need to consider, and I think these are the bigger paradigm shifters that are going to give us long-term indicators of success. And I think, from an ideological perspective, we talk about job creation and socioeconomic beneficiation for communities, but it's also about reducing the negative impacts that these corridors might place on people and environments through increasing human-wildlife conflict. How do we measure that? And then on a different sort of ideological perspective is what is the RAND value, private investment from donors, from government support, etc. And then if we start talking about the philosophical ones, what is the sense of place indicators that we could use in terms of measuring whether the people living in these landscapes actually feel that they are worthwhile, that they belong, that we need more, that we need to expand them. And if we're talking about intergenerational transfer, are the people that are working and living in these landscapes, are their families and their children wanting to stay on because they see the value that these landscapes bring? And I think, almost most importantly, are we shifting narratives? Is Joe Public starting to talk about how landscapes are valued as a positive, and wanting to become part and parcel of this bigger process? And I think, if we look at it from the perspective of government and the funders want to see the physical. Government wants to see the ideological, but the long-term durability of success is really dependent on the philosophical. And what we want to try and find with, for example, a corridor that allows leopards or cheetahs or elephants or priority species to move freely, it benefits communities from an ideological perspective, but it shifted how a farming district thinks about the wildness and the wilderness and from a philosophical perspective. So, not so straightforward. And I think where we try and measure success, it's highly complex and extremely difficult. Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Peter. That was a really interesting answer. It's almost as if the intangibles are as important as the tangibles here. And it's interesting that you referred to a feeling of belonging, and Nkabeng also used the word shared a lot when you spoke, Nkabeng. So, Nkabeng, my next question goes to you. What social opportunities and challenges arise when working with communities and landowners? How do landowners' trust building and incentive structure influence long-term corridor viability?
Now, thank you for that question. And with trust is quite an important word for us to be using in this context, because trust is something that's earned over time. So the longevity in that sense as well, as we mentioned earlier. But when we're actually working in and developing some of these living corridors, there's definitely opportunities there for landowners. And we are quite aware that they are also within those opportunities, there are challenges as well, because these are complex social systems that we're also taking into account. However, when corridors allow for landowners and communities to actually remain where they are, it's not as what we mentioned previously, where the doors were closed and we had to have physical boundaries. Now people can actually remain where they are, so livelihoods can continue and be enhanced in some ways as well. And this allows people to actually feel like now they're actually starting to participate when it comes to our conservation activities as well. And in so doing, it starts to create other opportunities. It starts to create employment in different ways, be it from restoration, nature-based economics, or other activities such as tourism. Rian went through a very comprehensive list of some of the social aspects that can go with this. And part of it that's quite an important one that's also become part of our lingo more recently as well, includes the wildlife economy. As we mentioned, with these corridors, we're aiming towards also getting that movement of wildlife across and seeing how we can actually integrate this into a wildlife economy. But what's actually quite important about that is that with these corridors, it allows us to start restoring some of these cultural connections, because from a social aspect, people can remain on the land still. It starts to create that cultural connection with the landscape, and it creates, yes, a shared space once again in the area, and it brings that custodianship in with it. But we have to be aware that there is complexity, as we mentioned, because it is social. So we take into account, for example, land tenure, historical distrust, and some of the competing land uses that may not be necessarily compatible. But these, even though these remain as really major challenges, these are still opportunities in themselves, because it allows us to start thinking a little bit differently. It can be a little bit of breaking down barriers in our minds of, but is this compatible? But once we bring in that social space, then we start seeing what can actually put food on the table, connect to value chains, and start being part of the economy as well. And since this is social, we have to be aware that it can't be transplanted onto people. It's not something that can just be enforced into thinking, and it can't be imposed. Trust works at the speed of relationships. So that's why that element of time is quite important. And that's why, as you mentioned, incentives also help as well. Because by nature as humans, we also want to know, okay, as I'm getting into some of these agreements as a land user, as a landowner, or as a community, what are some of the incentives that are going to help me want to stay on the land and actually reap some of these benefits? So we're quite cognizant of those elements as well. But we try to ensure that whatever is promoted as a potential incentive, that it still aligns with our conservation goals, as well as with the local aspirations as well. So those have to marry with each other quite closely. I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Nkabeng. That sounds like a real balancing act. And it sets up the next question for Ian quite nicely. Ian, how do corridors support migratory species and broader ecosystem processes? And what are the implications for predator management and human-wildlife conflict mitigation towards coexistence?
Thanks for that question. It's certainly not a trivial one, and definitely not in the African context. We must remember that corridors are not just there for the movement of some big charismatic animals. These are critical linking systems of ecologically intact habitat that are home to a suite of resident species and act as core protected areas themselves. So we must not downplay the importance of these corridors in terms of their broader landscape scale conservation functionality. With this in mind, when we look at how these corridors function in terms of their socio-ecological role, we need to consider a wide range of factors that they themselves drive in terms of people and wildlife. Many protected areas face extensive human-wildlife conflict challenges. mostly on their periphery, with some species spilling over into surrounding agricultural or human-dominated landscapes. And in the inverse, we often see some domestic livestock spilling into protected areas. This sort of human-wildlife conflict is not necessarily an issue with all species that are linked to protected areas and to corridors. Examples are rodent predators like black-winged kites and serval, where the protected areas enhance the populations of these sorts of species, but those species spilling over into agricultural areas is not an issue. It's a benefit. But when we talk about large predators and species like elephants, it becomes more of an issue in that it's more difficult for people to coexist with those organisms. We see this across the continent and all over the world. But in Africa, this is very much something that we think about on a day-to-day basis. And without going down this rabbit hole too deeply, human populations are growing faster than anywhere else in the world in Africa, and are projected to rise from around the current population of around 1.5 billion people to around 2.5 billion by 2050. This will account for around half of the global population growth over the next 2 decades. This is our reality, and we need to acknowledge it and plan for it. It means that protected areas are going to feel increasingly hard boundaries, even where they are unfenced. Corridors can alleviate these challenges through enabling animal movement and reducing the wildlife population stress within isolated protected areas. But we're going to need to plan carefully for the future and work hard to ensure that this coexistence is a reality in generations to come. And if this is to be a reality in the future, we need to establish these corridors in the now.
Thanks, Ian. So, yeah, that's once again sets up my next question to Rian very nicely. Rian, where you are working in the Eden to Addo project, a lot of economic development happening in that area. And one can even say that the corridor system itself will, as a success spin-off, create more economic development. How do you maintain your ecological integrity within such a precious system?
Thanks, Johan. So I think what's important to note is that they can coexist, protected areas and economic activities, so that we always love to use the example. I mentioned the Robbo Coastal Corridor where the Aardvark was. So one of the landowners there is a dairy farmer, and he has identified an area on his land that suits the corridor. And then the rest of the property, he is still actively farming as a dairy farm. So this shows how you can be within a protected environment, a legally protected environment, and create spaces for ecological function and corridors on your land, while still being, active with an active income stream through farming. So they really can work together. It's not either protected area or economic functionality of the landscape. So that's the one thing that I need to say. But we also need to recognize that these critically biodiverse areas need to be within the corridor areas, and that needs to be included in our spatial development frameworks. So if there is going to be any kind of economic development in terms of extractive industries, those should not be happening in the critically biodiverse areas and in the critical corridor areas. So we're very used to identifying critical biodiversity areas, when any kind of development is going to happen, whatever the development may be, whether it's an urban development or a mining development. But I think we need to take it to the next level, not only looking at the critical biodiversity areas, but are they critically important in terms of connectivity? And that needs to be included in our spatial development frameworks. So, so development, yes, can happen alongside, but not in the areas where it's going to cause long-term detriment to the integrity of the ecosystems that are our life-giving systems, not only for us, but for the rest of nature as well.
Thanks, Rian. What a beautiful example of the dairy farmer having the aardvark on his property. Peter, you previously mentioned that there's a philosophical mindset that also needs to take place. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife use and ethics. Do you feel that wildlife utilization and non-utilization models can coexist within living ecological corridors? And what ethical considerations should guide these approaches?
Yeah, good. Very controversial question. Obviously, you're sort of sitting at two ends of the dichotomy. And I think, again, it comes back to the complexity of the landscapes that we're working in. If we look at the Bushman's River in the Eastern Cape as an example, where some of our focus work is, on either end, we've got current private protected areas. In the middle, we've got 30 plus properties, which is private land ownership. Some of that private land is some of it is already going towards conservation in corridors. We have hunting, we have game breeding, we have community-owned land. And how do we bring those different opinions to the same table in a common direction? And it's extremely challenging to find those commonalities. I think what's important in all of it is that we need to start from a scientific rigor base, and then from an ethical and integrity baseline across the different sectors. You know, the wildlife utilization versus non-utilization is perhaps the most complex. Is it possible to bring them together? If we look at it purely from the wildlife perspective, extremely difficult. But if we look at it from the baseline perspectives of both parties are wanting to look after the land, so preserve the soils, get rid of alien vegetation, etc., we start finding common ground. And particularly, you know, water is a fantastic one, and the Bushman's River is a fantastic example that we can use. All those different thought processes or land uses are going to come around the same table, around a common factor of importance to them. And really, I think at a baseline level, if you look at a management plan for a wildlife utilization property versus a non-wildlife utilization property, you're probably going to be sitting around 85% commonalities, as I said, around the soils, around the alien plants, etc. So use that as your starting point, and then find pragmatic solutions around the points of disparity. I think what's important to realize is ultimately with the success of the corridors, it's actually about an economic model, and we haven't really touched on that. These corridors have to be financially sustainable into the future, and how do we reach that? And different people have different perspectives of that. Those perspectives are not necessarily wrong, they're different, and we need to look at the different viewpoints and try and find that common anchor to which we can move towards. And I believe we're sitting with a current state. We need to collectively determine what a future desired end state is going to look like, and then find the transitional steps of how we're going to get there. And you know, if we're talking about economics as a single factor, a hunter may be willing to move towards non-utilization if it is economically viable, but what are the steps that we need to take to get there? And I think we need to recognize that a lot of these corridors, humanity wants change now, immediately, but in reality, it's we're talking 15 years, 20 years, and that goes back to that philosophical perspective of how are we shifting the mindset towards these ethically, scientifically rigorous processes where not only ecosystems and biodiversity can win, but also, you know, the people and their different perspectives can win towards a common vision. Thanks, Johan.
Peter, I think a lot of people in international politics should consult with you at the moment. There are some common ground lessons to be learned there. Let's look at policy alignment and global frameworks. Ian, how do ecological corridors contribute to the National Protected Area Footprint and, by association, the Global Biodiversity Framework Target number 3, and what other global biodiversity framework targets do they contribute towards?
Yeah, thanks, Johan. By virtue of the fact that in the South African context, at least, many of these corridors are established through formal protected area processes, and we are very fortunate to have legislative structures that support these declarations. They contribute directly to the National Protected Area Footprint. And in some non-formal protected area instances, they are still managed in suitable conservation compatible ways that align to the criteria of the other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs as they're better known. So there are multiple different mechanisms that they can fall under in terms of their declaration or non-declaration, but as long as they're managed effectively, they can contribute directly to that 30 by 30 target that a lot of people speak about, which is target 3 of the GBF. When we look at some of the other targets, the corridors, just at a very cursory assessment, contribute directly, and I say directly because they contribute indirectly to a whole bunch of them, but directly they contribute to at least 6. And I'm just going to run through those quickly, just for the interest of the audience here. Target 1 speaks to planning and managing all areas to reduce biodiversity loss. Now, corridors contribute directly to that through biodiversity conservation. Target 2 speaks to the restoration of 30% of all degraded ecosystems. Now, corridors don't necessarily have to have a restoration focus, but in order to encourage ecosystem functionality, restoration should be one of the core focuses of these landscapes in order to make them long-term functional and ecologically capable. Target 3 we've kind of covered here, which is the 30 by 30 target, conserving 30% of land, water, and seas. Then target 4 speaks to halting species extinction, protecting genetic diversity, and managing human-wildlife conflicts. And I think all of the speakers have alluded to this in some way, shape, or form through the course of the discussion today. Then target 8 speaks to minimizing the impacts of climate change on biodiversity and building resilience. And corridors are absolutely critical for this in terms of enabling species to move. That amazing moving map of South America that Rian showed in the beginning really illustrates this. And then lastly, target 14, which is integrating biodiversity into decision-making at every level. And I think arguably this is, for me, one of the more important ones, because this spatial planning aspect and the long-term thinking around what landscapes are going to look like and how corridors are going to be shaped is absolutely critical in a developing world, such as we find ourselves in the African context.
Thanks, Ian. And that leads us to the semi-final formal question. I would like to go around the room with our 4 experts and ask them for their lessons learned, most important success and lessons learned in your work in corridors. Ian, you still have the mic, so if you want to go for it, please go for it.
Yeah, I think some of the key things are manage your expectations. As Peter was alluding to, we need to recognize the small wins, set ambitious but achievable goals, and really focus on the human aspects. We're not going to achieve these things without working with people across these landscapes. So while the end goal might be biodiversity and climate change mitigation and so on and so forth, as conservationists, those are the things that we want to achieve in the long term. But doing that without putting people first and foremost is going to be very short-sighted. So we need to take a holistic approach to these sorts of corridors, and we need to measure our expectations quite carefully.
Thanks, Ian. Rian, you are sitting next to Ian on my screen.
Thanks, Johan. So with Eden to Addo, we work mainly with private landowners through biodiversity stewardship, where they become the stewards of the biodiversity on their land. And as I said, many of them are actively farming. So the real wins are in working with those willing landowners who are keen and passionate to manage their land in a way that they are leaving a legacy for generations to come. And there are also real benefits, such as tax benefits that we haven't even mentioned. So if you declare your land as a nature reserve, you can claim back the full value of your property over 25 years, 4% of your income over 25 years. So sorry, 4% of the value of the property over 25 years. So yeah, there are the real wins, as I think Ian also alluded to, is actually the people network and working with the real champions on the landscape, the ones who are at the coalface of these extreme weather events, from drought to floods, and are having to be the custodians of the land, and who are needing support. So the successes are in what we love doing is creating opportunities. So linking farmers who are needing assistance with alien clearing with free herbicide through DFFE, or with land restoration workers who are paid through the Social Employment Fund. So creating these opportunities that are win-win-win situations, win for biodiversity, win for the farmers and custodians and stewards of the land, and win for the people who are needing employment in the area.
I love win-win-win situations. Peter, you are next up on my screen.
Yeah, for me, I think it's, we need to again recognize the complexity, but for us to succeed in the long term, we need to be willing to listen, but more importantly, hear. And it's very much, we've spoken about the people in this landscape. How do we get their support? And that's only going to be through listening, through hearing to different perspectives, trying to find pragmatic solutions. It's difficult that we must set our lines of compromise that we are prepared to cross on either end very carefully. And I think, build that trust, build that integrity, build that scientific rigor, make sure that we are highly ethical in everything that we are doing, and bring the people with us. If we bring the people with us, the species, the pattern and process is going to benefit. But if we, very much, yeah, I think let me leave it at that. Is we talk about corridors from a biodiversity perspective or an ecological perspective. It's actually about a people perspective first, and these are long-term processes where we must be willing to have highly adaptive management and change and listen very very rapidly and bring people to the table. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. I love that you frame it as a state of mind. Nkabeng, first of all, a special thank you to you, because you helped us to bring this wonderful panel of people together tonight, and it truly is a distinguished panel that you linked us to. So really, thank you to you. And with that, I would like you to, Nkabeng, ask you for your lessons learned as well as your take message before we open the floor for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Johan. And I think I'm going to echo a lot of what the colleagues have already mentioned, with some of the lessons learned on both sides, being the biodiversity, ecological side and the social side. But I'd say one of the key lessons that were learned was flexibility. And that would be in terms of, it's quite essential just to be aware that there's implementation that needs to happen. There's maps that we can draw up. We can have all these wonderful plans that need to take place, but we need to be flexible once we actually start working with people, and once we actually start taking into consideration the lives that are on the ground as well, and the realities that people are experiencing. So when it comes to long-term relationships and making sure that there's certain understandings and agreements in place, and that strong foundations are built, it does require an element of flexibility. So that was some of the lessons I'd have to say for as a take home. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Nkabeng.
This was a paper that we've been unpacking, and what I love about it is that it's looking at people-nature relationships, exactly as we've been unpacking in this conversation today. And there's different paradigms and different ways that have evolved over time, and specifically looking at that relationship of people-nature relationship. Are we separate, coupled, or intertwined? And how people see themselves in that relationship. So what's fantastic about this, if I can speak to each of the different paradigms, separate, coupled, and intertwined, in the separate narrative, people see nature as something that's distinct from them, something that's different and other. So they'll look at Table Mountain and say, Table Mountain's over there, and I'm over here, so I'm separate from nature. And in the past, yes, in some ways, that has been what the view has been of protected areas and what the view and experience has been before the corridors actually started becoming functional. And then we also have the coupled paradigm or the coupled narrative, which looks at where people see themselves in there. They understand that ecosystems provide services, be it from climate, be it water, be it livelihoods, but they see that there is a relationship with nature, which starts to change the mentality and approach around it. And then you have the intertwined. That narrative, interestingly enough, is where people actually start to see themselves as being part of nature. And that's one of the winning places. Not to say that any of these paradigms are right or wrong, or narratives are right or wrong, but when people start to see themselves as part of nature, that's when those relationships start to become stronger, and that's when that longevity starts to become a bit of a reality. And I guess what we could say about that is that in this sense that people don't have to see themselves as one or the other. In some instances, you are entwined. In some instances, you're coupled. And in some instances, as Rian was mentioning, yes, we do have to be separate because it is critical for a certain area to be isolated. So in that sense, I'll leave that as the take-home message.
What about wildlife corridors between marine protected areas? What about the serious unintended consequence of joining aquatic ecosystems with man-made canals and tunnels, such as the Orange Fish Tunnel? Interesting question. Ian, you volunteered.
So I'll have a go at that. I mean, one of the core things here, and I'm going to keep my answer fairly brief, is that we need to be careful of what we define as an ecological corridor. Interbasin transfers, I don't think should be qualified as ecological corridors. They're sometimes a necessity in terms of water security, but in almost all instances, they are an ecological nightmare. They cause all sorts of challenges in terms of the shift of invasive species and the intermixing of threatened species and so on and so forth. I mean, the numbers of challenges are exorbitant. So I think the fundamental principle here is that those sorts of interbasin transfers certainly don't qualify as what we're calling ecological corridors. They're a functional need, and they need to be very, very carefully considered before they're implemented.
Yeah, sometimes the solution is in reading the manual and checking the definition, and in this case, it brings a lot of clarity. Jasper Klitte, Jasper, you're already there. Please unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, first of all, thank you guys. It was a lot, great notice of a meeting you've got. I think it's very impressive and very informative. Just not a question, basically more a statement. I'm a trustee of Space for Elephants. We unfortunately not closed down, we just went dormant in 2020 when COVID hit us because all our sponsors withdrew. But we established corridors in KwaZulu-Natal because Space for Elephants' dream is to create a corridor all the way from Underberg through Isamangaliso, St. Lucia Wetland Park, all the way to Angola. And that was the way elephants used to migrate before human beings came in to fence it. And we had many discussions of how to approach it, how to do it. And at the end of the day, we settled on MAP program. And I know Nkabeng mentioned biosphere. biosphere reserves, and I think it's a good idea for the panel to take notice of it. And we did it successfully in KwaZulu-Natal, where we look at the man and biosphere, we're looking after humankind and animals alike, where we create wilderness areas where there's only footpaths allowed, buffer zones around it, where your lodges and your vehicle tracks are, and then transitional zones where your industrial areas are. And in between, you link your wilderness areas with corridors. And a corridor doesn't necessarily need to be a waterway, it can be a mountain peak as well. We negotiated with rural communities and farmers, and I must admit the rural community was the easier one to negotiate with because they used to live like that. The farmers, at the end of the day, if you couldn't reach the agreement, we fenced them in to keep the elephants, especially away from the sugarcane. So yeah, we had the experience and we did it successfully between Tanda and Sislui, Umfolozi, through Pongola Game Reserve, Narwell, Jozini in Swaziland, or Eswatini as it's called now. So those corridors are open at the moment. And it was quite interesting from a ground level perspective to negotiate with the people and the successes we had. So yeah, that's just in short my statement. And thanks again for you guys. From a practical point of view, that we've done physically on the ground through trial and error. But at the end of the day, we managed to achieve quite a lot of corridors that is still today operational because once it's open, it's open. And it's not only animals that use corridors, it's all animals. We focused on elephants, but it's lions, it's wild dogs, it's especially wild dogs that make use of corridors. So its nature comes back to the area as the animals start moving into it. That's just my statement, basically, not a question. And thanks to you guys.
Thanks, Jasper. We're very happy that you made it. That elephant wasn't so happy that you shared the corridor with it. So it's great that you made it here. I see Rian's hand is up. Rian, you would like to comment?
Yeah, I think Jasper just made a very good point, and that is that the traditional way of thinking of conservation is to fence animals in. But what he mentioned is rather fencing in the human activity. So it's a paradigm shift. It's flipping the way we think of conservation. So, instead of fencing wildlife in, we need to fence in our livestock farming. We need to fence in our human activities, our homesteads, so that there are spaces within our properties, whether private, and linking national parks and protected areas and other effective conservation measures. But yeah, so that was a very important point I think he made. And the other point that he made is that it's not just about the charismatic animals, it's not just about the elephants and the wild dogs. It's about the sunbirds who won't fly over large stands of alien invasive trees. It's about the solitary bees. It's about a deeply interconnected system and not just the charismatic animals, because we need the pollinators. We need the whole web of life for it to be functional. So I think he made two very good points, and good for you, Jasper. Sounds like some incredible work that has been done there.
Yeah, great work done there in Zululand. So the next question is really, I expect to find this in the TUT exam papers. It's the how-to question from Charles Mpaka, and it's great to have people from all over Africa here in the room tonight. How do you establish a really functional ecological corridor in a landscape already occupied by people? I have in mind a stretch between Kasunga National Park, a Malawian national park, which lies in the border between Malawi and Zambia, and Lukusuzi National Park in Zambia. The International Fund for Animal Welfare is trying to establish a corridor to allow wildlife to move between the two national parks. So if I can reframe it, where do you start? I don't know who wants to start with this one. What is the first step? Who do you call on the day that you decide you want to establish a corridor?
I think, as has been mentioned by all the colleagues in our closing comments, the first place to start is with the people, of course, and it's with deep and meaningful stakeholder engagement with all the different stakeholders and to really listen and to really hear what are the challenges on the landscape. What are people really dealing with on a day-to-day basis? So, I'm sure there are human-wildlife conflict issues in the corridor that he speaks of if there are elephants there and there are people growing crops. So
Yep.
yeah, how can the people's real challenges that affect their livelihoods be dealt with so that the priority of elephant movement is not placed above the subsistence needs of people living in that landscape. So yeah, it's those very meaningful workshops, discussions where people really feel heard and listened to, and that you can start seeing the patterns of the common challenges, and start working on solutions together collaboratively to those challenges.
So it starts with listening.
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, but his next comments, you expected everything that he would ask next. The human-wildlife conflict issues, serious human-wildlife conflict issues in that area. So you addressed it perfectly, Rian. Peter, it looks like you also want to comment there.
No, I think, Rian's summed it up really well. Is you've got to, again, get out there, listen to the people. What do they want? Are they going to accept it? And what are the factors that we're going to have to consider to make it a reality, to mitigate negative influences on the people of the landscape? It's got to be a positive win-win.
Mm-hmm. So a very interesting question next from Carlin Miller, asking, is legislation ready to support these initiatives? And it's difficult to know who to ask because you're all really hands-on involved here. And Kabeng, I see you unmuted, so please go for it.
Yeah, so interesting enough, and it is a very good question. And interestingly enough, legislation has already set up some of the enabling measures that can be put into place. Sometimes it's how we perceive it and how we interpret it, that sometimes we put a bit of a mental block around it. But legislation does have some elements built into it that are enabling and that are encouraging to actually push in towards that direction. And this is how, and these are some of the steps that need to be taken, and these are the things that need to be considered. So I believe that, yes, there are elements of legislation that once we start looking at some of the regulations, some of the what's been built in there, it's looking at nature and looking at corridors, but also looking at from how is it going to, I don't want to say serve, but how is it going to also benefit human and livelihoods as well. And that's actually already built into legislation. It's a matter of how we're reading it and interpreting it. That's where we don't always perceive it as enabling.
Okay, so we just need to find how this issue fits into existing legislation, basically. Thanks, Nkabeng. Question from Karen. What about crime against wildlife? Does this proximity of wildlife and people create additional wildlife crime, and how do you deal with that? Any takers on that one? Peter?
Yeah, so again, a great question. I think it goes back to those initial steps that we've kind of spoken about. The more you set up your initial engagements, the more you bring the partnerships, the people of the landscape on board, the greater your chances of reducing those crime interfaces are. I think landscapes can actually benefit crime reduction at a greater, broader landscape level as well, as long as they are set up right from the beginning. And it's about, I think what we haven't maybe perhaps mentioned this evening is ownership. What we need to get is the people of the landscape to accept ownership of these landscape corridors, which are hopefully going to bring beneficial benefits to these people. I think if we're dealing with priority species such as rhino, yes, there is always a risk as we increase these proximity that crime can be an issue. Importantly, I think, again, it's that participation. are we able to get the anti-poaching units coming from local communities, that they are part and parcel of this broader landscape? What are the benefits that are going back? And we've certainly found that where there is true engagement with communities and communities are part and parcel from the beginning, they are the better protectors at the end of the day. So it's a risk, absolutely, but I think in the long term, it's how we set up from the beginning. And in many cases, I think perhaps that's where our faults are. We don't go back to that philosophical starting point and we're entering it midway, which is why we're ending up tripping and making fundamental mistakes that could have been avoided.
So where and how you start is really important. Jasper, I saw that your hand was up. It went down again. I'm not sure were your question answered.
Yes, no, Peter did very well. We was very successful in reducing poaching in KwaZulu-Natal by allowing the community to understand the asset that they live next to. So we educate school children. We started with the children, and then we worked up the ranks to the parents and the wiser communities. And by doing that and employ them on game reserves, so we started to build relationship between the private landowners, the private game reserves, and the rural communities on the outside. Poachers has to come through the rural communities to get to the game lodge. So they were acting as an early warning system without us telling them, warn us when somebody's coming to poach, for instance. So the anti-poaching units had early warning signal coming from the communities. And that worked quite successfully just by employing people to make linen for the lodges, to make pots for water in the tents or wherever, whichever thing, and they're getting paid for it. So we taught the community, you sitting with an asset next to you, protect that asset. And that was the way that we not stopped, but we minimized anti-poach or poaching in the area. Thanks.
Thanks, Jasper. That is a beautiful lesson learned. I think you're going to receive applause from Dr. Cheryl Ogilvie, who works up at Ndumu as your neighbor there, who is a big fan of environmental education. So, yeah. I see, Gustav, your hand is up. Great to see you in the room.
Thanks for such a great talk. I'm really learning a lot. I was just, while you guys speaking, another opportunity I see, if populations get fragmented, then becomes a biodiversity risk. But when we're managing alien invasive and bush encroachment, maybe use this as a strategy. If we can create the opposite, so we're trying to break the corridors for the alien invasives, be it water, wind, whatever medium or animal vector they use. If we can use the opposite, can it be used as a conservation tool and just as a different way of thinking? So obviously this is how ecology works. So the same principles must apply to alien invasives. So if we can prevent them from moving by stopping corridors, just the opposite of what we're trying to do with native species. Thanks.
Thanks, Gustav. That's real good thinking there. There's a question in the chat from Ishmael Baloy. Since many animals can only tolerate a certain level of density to exploit environmental variables with ease, how do you ensure that the saturation level of each living corridor is regulated with sustainable efforts? And that's a real ecological management question there. Very impressive from a second-year nature conservation student.
I can attempt to give it a shot, but I think one of our colleagues was speaking earlier about the use versus non-use of wildlife and biodiversity. So I think it does speak quite closely to that. And in some spaces, I mean, we have natural cycles of predation, we have drought, we have natural processes that are playing out. So in some ways that will naturally work on the wildlife. Yes, the corridors are there obviously to allow them to move and adapt, but that does not mean that these stresses and these natural pressures will not act on them. So we still have to acknowledge that side. We'll be able to regulate some of these densities. And then there's also that use, that wildlife use element of it as well, that can also be used as a bit of a regulator of those densities. That's the short way of answering it, but I'm not sure if one of my colleagues wants to take it a little bit further. Yeah.
Rian, you're
Give it a go.
welcome. Peter,
So I
go for
think, sorry, Rian, I think really important is we recognize landscapes are fragmented, that there's been a negative human impact that has changed ecological and functioning at the end of the day. Regardless of the size of the corridor, whether it's huge or massive, we are going to reach inverted commas saturation points. If that corridor is not functioning at all trophic levels and fully ecological pattern and process, humanity, which means us, has to step in as the pseudo pattern and process and rectify what needs to happen or what is not happening on the landscape. So if predators, for example, are not on the landscape, we need to simulate that process until such time as we can get predators on the landscape or scavengers or fire management, etc., etc. And I think, part of the bigger discussion, we often forget about this process-based management, and really how does humanity intervene in the appropriate way to ensure proper ecological pattern and process is happening across the landscape that we're working in.
Rian, we'd love to hear your opinion on this as well, please.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to say, and Peter has already touched on it, as has Nkabeng, that it also allows the ecological processes to heal, and so that the natural predator-prey interactions will allow that balance to be returned, as will the migratory tendencies of some of the species. So that's how it always worked. There always was balance. So this connectivity and the idea with the corridors is that there is this opportunity for migration and dispersal in response to a lack of water, lack of food, seasonal climate change, etc. So those processes, the concept behind corridors is that, or connectivity, is that it enables those processes to function again.
Fantastic. Ishmael, I hope that answers your question. Thank you for that question. There's a hand up in the chat. Celindo Gutle, we would love to hear your question.
So for some people here may know me, but I did some work in the Eastern Cape. I engaged with some of the communities in the Sarapadman area, doing some interviews, asking interesting questions relating to human-wildlife conflict, particularly with leopards. And the idea of establishing functional corridors and working with the communities, the biggest question I really want to ask these guys is that how do you rebuild the trust between conservation authorities and the communities in landscapes where the communities are angry of historic events where they've lost livestock, they're angry when they've reported these things, there hasn't been satisfactory response from the entities that are supposed to be responding to deal with those threats. So if you're trying to establish a corridor and there's an angry village in the middle of that corridor, how do you best resolve that so that you can bring that community on your side, so that you can have sort of like that system that they have in KZN, where they got the early warning system from the community where they can actually counter these issues that we're facing? How do you rebuild that corrosive trust? Thanks.
Thank you, Celindo Gutle. Wonderful and practical question from the field. Who wants to take that one?
Give it a go again. Esty, great to hear you, and when are you coming to visit? It's been a while. Trust takes a long time to build. It is broken very quickly. And I think, again, the starting point is the willingness to engage, willingness to listen, willingness in some cases to take abuse from frustration, and then try and work with what are the easy wins that you can quickly achieve, and over time is build that trust and work at the more complex processes. I think, what all of us that have spoken this evening, in many ways, one of our core functions is problem solvers. But from the point of listening to the landscape as the starting point to find that common solution, and being willing to ask the landscape what is their perception of a solution and what is the process. So again, very, very difficult questions that I think we're all still learning, and we don't actually have always the easy answers. But it's that willingness to participate that is absolutely crucial.
No, thanks. But perhaps if I may add on to what Peter is saying, because it's absolutely true that with the approaches that have started going forward, is that it's more holistic and really taking that opportunity to sit, listen, and appreciate somebody's lived reality. We're no longer at a place, as we mentioned earlier, of imposing, but rather to allow people to have that space to be able to say where it is that they're coming from and what their fears might be, what their concerns might be, their frustrations, and not to come in full force. And what helps with coming in from a holistic perspective is that we're able to cushion our responses. It's not just, okay, ecologically, this is what happened. Okay, socially, this is what happened. And we're able to now respond from many different facets, even from economic aspects as well. So I think these approaches going forward help to sort of get that balance of being able to hear, exactly as Peter was saying, being able to listen to where people have come from and what the experiences have been.
Thank you, Nkabeng. Really, really valuable. And I just want to thank people like Celine Noguhle. I'm not sure if that is your correct, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. I hope I am. It's really great to have people in the room that are on the front lines of conservation, bringing that kind of questions into our discussion. It really makes the discussion much richer. There's a question from Bradley, a very practical question. What would your opinion be about plantations as corridors? In basically, it's an organized unit of invasive plants. Can that be a corridor?
How's it, Bradley? Bradley's a colleague of mine. Assuming it's the same Bradley Gibbons. In the South African context, we certainly wouldn't consider a monoculture of exotic trees as a functional corridor. These plantations end up being effectively green deserts. So they're not really effective corridors for the movement of our indigenous species. This might not necessarily be the case in the Northern Hemisphere, where a lot of these trees come from. So this sort of tree planting corridor is potentially a functional corridor, but not in our circumstance. So in most of our instances, that's not really a reality, even to try and create corridors between our indigenous forests.
Thanks, Ian. So I have a soft spot for opportunistic people. So Devin raised his hand as I was saying we are closing up. So Devin, you're taking the last question.
Thank you kindly. I feel honored. Also, just a brief word to say thank you very much for running this incredibly insightful and purposeful and thoughtful event. Thank you to everybody attending. I think my question is directed at Rian. Just hearing a little bit about how much needs to go into supporting landowners to create something like this. We heard there about how much time needs to be spent listening, and that takes time. And then, helping to support them with all the legislative advice and all the practical tools that a project like yours is providing. I want to know, how is a project like yours funded? How does that happen? And also, how would somebody support if they wanted to?
Thanks, Devin. Yeah, so this corridor work is that real quote where it says you planting trees that you may never sit under the shade of. This is decades long work. As I think some of the colleagues have mentioned, I think Ian was the one who said we're looking at 50 to 100 years. This is not small scale work. So yeah, the vision is long and the vision is big. But the small steps are being made daily. And so we are a nonprofit organization, and as is EWT, as is I'm sure Conservation Landscapes Institute, and Nkabeng works for Sand Park, so of course our government organization. So the nonprofits are 100% dependent on funding through grants and through private donors. So you visit our websites and see how you can support us. That would be fantastic. And so that's one way that you can, contribute and become actively engaged in these corridors, is by supporting them with funding. And the other thing I wanted to say is that if that's not a possibility for you, these corridors that we've been speaking are landscape level corridors, but you as an individual in your own home space, in your own garden, with your neighbors and your green belts, can start establishing functional corridors by ensuring that you're planting indigenous to your area, so that it's supporting the local pollinators, birds, amphibians, whatever it might be, and working with your neighbors so that you can start connecting, these areas into urban corridors that eventually link to river systems, ocean systems, and up into the mountains. So this is not something that is for everyone else to do, but everyone in their own way can create corridors in their own home and living environments.
Thank you, Rion. And I think with that, we are going to conclude tonight. We really appreciate this panel. I think all of you are such examples of this way of conservation as an act of humility, an act of long-term commitment and listening to people, and planting that tree that you may never sit under. So we really salute you for your work, and thank you for sharing your insights and your hard-earned knowledge on this platform. Thank you, everybody, and we will see you soon. Have a lovely evening.